So last week we started the introduction from Rav Pinkus in his Sefer Sha'arim Batfila. We only got through like the first section of it. So we're going to carry through, and hopefully we'll be able to get through the rest of that intro today. This sort of set us up nicely for really digging into more on the Tefillah side. So what we talked about last week was he was really sort of setting us up, describing the importance of Tefillah. And if you remember, he said that tefillah is not just an opportunity to ask for our needs, but it's also, sort of a gateway that unless we make the request, the flow of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to give us doesn't happen. It has to go through that gateway called tefillah. So he starts now. He says, Min hayesodos lahatzlacha ba'avodas atfilahu lishtado ba b'derech gadlus ve'aliyah. So now what he wants to get into is how do we get better, right? How do we improve our ability to daven? And he says, Hainu lishtado la'alos liskadim ba behadraga shlav achar shlav. And he says that similar to other endeavors, the way to grow and to become better is it has to be a sort of a step-by-step process, right? Rung after rung. Be'amah Torah pashutu shehamatorah hi la'alos madrega achar madrega. V'zakol ikar avodaseinu shahari mi shalamad kama shanim lesof motze es atzma ba'osa madrega behavona ba'amkus b'yidiyas Torah kama be'ez shenichnas l'kushon yechsha be'enei atzma b'nei chavera. He says, he compares it to when we, sort of enter into learning Torah. And he was a Rosh Yeshiva, so a lot of who he's talking to are really like yeshiva boys, right? So, but he says that, when you enter yeshiva, there's sort of this expectation that the first year you're starting to learn a little bit, as you get into the second year, third year, et cetera, that your skills and your abilities are going to grow, right, as a student.
Jeff, could you make the print a little bigger, please?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, good. Okay. So he says, Kein hadavar b'tefillah, gam bat tzarich la'alos yizkadem legado miyom liyom, mizman lizman, mishana l'shana. The same thing about tefillah. We should be trying to grow in our tefillah day to day from, time period to time period, like he's probably referring to like, Elul Zman and Zman Choref, et cetera, but, from sort of season to season and from year to year. וצריך להיות שאינו דומה תפילת בוחר בשיר א' שמספלל כמו צורם מסחיל לתחילת בוחר בשיר ב' שיסקדם יוסר יחד עם הבנוסו הנוספת בסוגיית הגמרא. And he says that we wouldn't expect that, a first year student is going to be able to daven the same way that a second year or a third year student is, just like we wouldn't expect that a first year boy can be sitting in a third year Gemara shir.
Jeff, just sorry to interrupt, but last week we learned that learning and tefillah are not the same thing. That understanding tefillah and learning is not the same thing. So I'm confused about how you grow on tefillah versus how you grow on learning.
So, okay, absolutely. He hasn't gotten there. What he's really doing at this point is just telling us that should be our approach. Our approach should be that we should be thinking about tefillah in a growth, perspective, just like by Torah. But absolutely, you are correct. He hasn't gotten into how we do it, and that's what's coming next. Okay, so it says, "Kein besugias tefillah tfisaso v'avodas tzrichim sheyeh b'mala acheres legamrei." Right, our capabilities should be growing. Okay, v'kol shekein bacher b'shir gimel shekfar amru omer chabura mizman lezman umechadish chidush Torah tzarech shetehei tfilaso im havanas acheres v'cheshek acher. V'taschar lisnotzes b'kirbo eish tshuka liskar l'kadosh baruch hu b'yeser seis. And another thing that he's starting to point out now is that as you grow in Torah, that should also grow within you, that sort of fire that you want to connect, just like when we learn Torah, we sort of feel like we're connecting to something bigger, we're connecting to something spiritual, we're connecting to Hashem, that we should also feel that way, that through that, I want to connect to my davening too. And that's, I think, one of the ways that he connects Torah with tefillah, is that the growth in Torah should bring about, the desire to also grow in your tefillah. And that's what he's saying, that both of them sort of should be going together. But he says the problem is in our times, kama aluv hamatzav shebechor hanichnas l'shir rishon yeshiva v'yotzi achar kama shonim shel izgadlus belimud Torah belimud Talmud chacham meula l'umas zed b'tefillah yotzehu kama b'yam shenichnas. The problem is that he says, right, very often they're out of whack. They're not synchronized. When you walk in the door, your capability in Tefilah and your capability in Torah are pretty much at a similar level. But what ends up happening is after a few years in yeshiva, your Torah is way up here and your Tefilah is still down below. It hasn't really grown. And he says, I think that's his observation as a Rosh Yeshiva, that's a problem today. Okay, Levai, lo garum, is that he says, halavai, they shouldn't have gotten worse. They're only staying at the same level that they were when they walked in the door. It says, why is that? We have to work on Tefilah. It doesn't just come. And it's not, we have to try and grow in it and not just, saying the words and sort of going through the motions. Unless we're putting in the effort, it's not going to happen. We're not going to get, we're not going to progress. We're not going to get better at it. But Nebuchadnezzar, V'yisrav as Beis Hashem as called Beis Gadol Saraf Be'esh. So it talks about in the pasuk in Malachim that when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, it refers to it as the Beis Hashem and a Beis Gadol. So Pirush Chazal, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Echad Amar Makom Shemegadlin Bo Torah, Echad Amar Makom Shemegadlin Bo Tefilah. Was it because it sort of, what is the Beis Gadol? What was it increasing? What was it enlarging? So it's machlokas. What was it Torah or was it Tefilah? The Kamosha Besa Hamedrash, who Makom Nizgada Bo B'Torah, came Besa Tefilah, who Makom Nizgada Bo B'Tefilah. Just like a base Medrash is a place that you grow in Torah, base Tefilah is a place that you also grow in Tefilah. Var Amar Chazal Ad Tefilah Devarim Ha'omdim Berumo Shel Olam U'Bnei Adam Mezalzlim Behen Zu Tefilah. The Gemara in Brachos tells us that the things that sort of stand on the the most exalted in the world. And here you have people who completely mezalzel, right? Sort of treat it as if it's nothing. What is that? That's Tefilah. That's what the Gemara in Brachos tells us. But you can't get to the lofts, the high, lofty areas of the world unless you climb the ladder. And not just sort of stand at the base and sort of making circles around it. You have to see yourself that you're able to grow and to move up that ladder. And if not, if you don't put in that sort of time and effort and thought into it, you end up just sort of circling the ladder and never able to go up the ladder. So, Uri, I think to your point, I think we're going to start to get into, so how do we do this? And I think he's got some really just basic ideas. Like this isn't, we're not going to get into any kind of, crazy, Kabbalistic ideas of what we have to do to become better at Tefilah. It's just the basic ideas. It says, Yeshna Nakuda Chashuva, Shaharbe Toimba. And there's something very important here that many make a mistake with. Rabim Choshim Shalibet Tefilah hi beikar ayadei aliyah begadlus ha'adam taras halev kedusha kiruva hakadosh baruch hu v'emes hi devadai kaisher mizaskim bemadregos gevos v'ramos ele heima yezoros hamagvim legadlus amitis. So he says people make the mistake to think that you have to somehow transform yourself and to really become much more tahor and go after Kedusha, and we have to really be focused on how do I get closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and all these different ideas. And he says that at the end of the day, those actually prevent us. Those actually get in the way, those ideas. He says really what we have to focus on is how do we get the skill set. It's a skill set like any other. He says, Knias umanus hatfilahi rak ayadei hakdashus zman v'hasmada. He says the way you do it is you have to set aside time and you have to be consistent and constant about it. Hergo ve'avoda kosher ma'asis. You have to do this, and it's like a physical activity that you have to do and set aside time for. Kama belimud Torah dafal pi de madrega satora hema madrega shel elyonos amitis derech lalos besulam ha'aliyah betorah larachenu he beikar ayadei amav yagia. Says again, making that connection to a melus b'Torah or growth in Torah, it only happens when we put in the time and effort. He says the same thing as by Tefilah. That's the same idea that without that we won't grow. Belimud harbe dape gemara, shmias harbe svaros yisharos. Right, if we go through a lot of dapim of Gemara and we're listening and we're going to shir and we're learning what the different svaros are, how do we understand the Gemara? We really sort of break our teeth over it. Shlilas svaros kumos achakonim darache halimud misraglim bedarache svara shal Gemara verishonim. Right, that's how you start to progress. Ukamo kol umanos she niknes ayadei nisar vehergo behadracha yeshora shal mumchim. And he says this is true of any sort of skill set. The only way you do it is through repetition and and a lot of work, a lot of effort. So kain hu betorah v'chein hu betfilah. Same by Torah, same by Tefilah, but tzarech la'amo kashus bezmanim rabim ad shedarche Tefilah chodrim lekochos ha'adam v'nasim pshutim etzlo v'chelik mimenu. You do it until it becomes a part of you, until it becomes something that you're familiar with and you understand, and it feels like any other, sort of feels like the tool in the hand of the artisan. So ikra Tefilah shehu lahargi. Yeah.
Yeah, you see, until you understand it. So comprehension is part of Tefilah?
So it is, and I think we're gonna get there. It is a sort of a slow process. We're gonna see what that really means. What is comprehension of Tefilah? But certainly it has to incorporate comprehension. Like we saw already 2 weeks ago, and we're gonna go back through those sources again. Is that it's not simply a matter of understanding the meaning of each word, because like we've spoken about, that by itself doesn't always solve the problem, right? I mean, and I think the biggest the clearest example for most of us is when we think about slichos or, like kinos on Tisha B'Av, you can show me the English translation for those and I can still be just as lost as when I'm looking at the Hebrew. So it has to be more than just understanding the meaning of the words, right? We want to understand why did Chazal put the tefillahs in the way they did? What's important about the order of them? What's important about each paragraph? So we're going to see that. But at this point, what we're really sort of doing is, even before we get to that point, we want to sort of build a structure for, what should I be doing? And you can see he's starting to build that structure for us to show that it has to be time that we're spending outside of Tefilah, outside of shul, to be able to be better at davening and just get more out of it. So here's where we're starting. So ikra Tefilah, shehu lahargish she'omid lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'metzius lahargish kirvaso metziuso v'kirvaso yisbarachem metzius mamashis lo pechos mikol metzius pshuta hamocheres lanu. So he says the first thing that we have to really understand, or really, I guess, maybe internalize, is that we have to feel that we're always standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that has to really be something that becomes part of us again. It just becomes, just as familiar as we are, like with the furniture around us, is physical and is there. We also have to realize that Hashem is present as well. And it says, "Tzarich lezeh herga rav ad shenasev v'nihiyeh chelek mitchuchaso v'hativis." And this has to be something that we continue to work on. And he quotes the parak in Mesilas Yesharim, parak Yutas. V'hine shlosha dvarim tzarich sheistako ha'adam yizbonim hetiv kedei sheyagia el zo sayira. He says there are 3 things that we have to, continue to observe and to contemplate in order to get to a state of where we have yira, meaning that, that sort of understanding of that Hashem is present in our lives, that we are standing in front of Hashem at all times. That the problem is that we don't physically see him. The eye doesn't catch the fact that Hashem is here. And that is the most difficult part, is that there's no physical nature of this. We have to have it in our mind. Yeah, and our senses don't help us with this. Amnam. However, Mishahu Baal Seichel Navon b'ma'at his bonus v'simas lev yachol yigvo belibo amintus hadavar. But he says, if you really sort of think about it and understand, what is it that we believe? How is it that we look at the world around us? He says it doesn't take that much. It's not that much of a leap of faith to realize that when we think about things the way that, from a Jewish perspective, we realize that God is very much incorporated in our life. We don't believe that God is sort of completely distant and uninterested in what we're doing. So once we sort of have that understanding, he says it's not that big of a leap of faith to say Hashem is always present and standing, we're sort of standing in front of Hashem. Right? That's who we are supplicating in front of, and that's who we're making our requests in front of. And he's listening to what we're saying, and he's weighing it out. Just like when we're speaking to a friend, and that person is listening to what we're saying and hears us. Once you have that in your mind, then we can start to say, okay, now that we realize that Hashem is in front of us, as we're seeing all of those tehillas that we say in davening and all the brachos that we make, we can exalt Hashem in our own mind as to what Hashem's place is and what our place is, in relation to Hashem. Okay, I'll call mini shlema shetucha machshavosinu lidmoso lahavin va'od tzarich shizbonim al shiflosa adam ubechisusa. We have to understand our place too, that we really, our own failures, our own, limitations, and how much we need a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Lefi chomriosa v'gasosav koshakin lefi hachatoim shachet meodo. Ki al kol ela iefshar shelo yecher libo v'lo yirash ba'odo medaber dvar lefonav yizbarach mazger shemo mishtadr lehartzos lo ayin sham. And the end of this piece of the Mesilas Yesharim is saying that once we put ourselves in our own place where we should be, we also should be approaching Hashem with a little bit of fear and sort of anxiety, realizing that we are far from perfect, and we really do need Hashem's rachamim at all times. So it says, Lahasi kol zeh yoser b'mashet tzarech lihisamek u'lishalev b'taharas halev. So understanding this much more so than trying to work on these ideas of, taharas halev and, and just different ways of connecting to Hashem. Tzarech lihizgaragel b'dvarim elu lachshav b'hem lizkar b'pam achar pam asher chusho yizgarlu sheberega shenigash leTefilah hari hu b'mitzius omed lifnei Hashem yizbarach pshutuk mashmo mamash. Says that's the first step for us, is understanding when we walk into shul, what are we doing? What are we there for? And the fact that Hashem is waiting there for us, right? For our davening. Just having, I think that mindfulness, I think is really what he's saying, the word that we might use today, be mindful of what we're trying to do when we're in shul. That's step number one. Tosefes lo, poseches lo sha'arei havana beharbe sugios, kenhu b'tefillah. He says there are times when we're learning in Torah, and there's different klalim that come up, right? There's different klalim that we learn, and a klal will be applicable in many different situations. You'll learn it once in a shir, in one sugya, and then that same that same idea, it's a gezerah shava, it's a binyan av, it's all these different klalim that we learn, but they become applicable in many different places. So he says, so too by tefillah. ולכן צריך להשתדל לקנוס בקיוס בפרטי דרכי עבודת התפילה, שידיע קלה יכול להקנוס לו מספר רב של תפילס טובות. So he says a few really key ideas become very applicable across davening in general, and that's what we have to strive for, and that's what we need to that's where we need to get.
So far, he hasn't prioritized Tefilah over Limud Torah.
Correct. And that's what we saw last time, was that you really can't prioritize Tefilah over Limud Torah. However, what he's saying is that in our generation, Tefilah is really important, right? That we saw that because we need to open up the gates so that Hashem is providing, what we need and bringing us closer to Yemos HaMashiach. One thing that seems, and I don't know that he'll say it explicitly, but one thing that seems to be coming out too is that if we're spending time in a limud of Tefilah, that seems like that also might be providing you with limud Torah, right? Because what we're doing right now, we're doing limud Tefilah, but we're also doing limud Torah. So again, they're almost, they're certainly connected, and you can't disconnect the two together. But I think what he's also saying is this can't be the only thing that you're involved with. Tefilah cannot stand by itself. We still need, we still need to be learning Torah, in other facets as well.
But Limud Torah doesn't lead you, he said, to better Tefilah.
Right, exactly. And I think that's the thing. The growth of both sort of goes together, or at least they should, right? Ideally, the growth in Torah should lead to growth in Tefilah. Growth in Tefilah should also lead to growth in Torah. So he says, Dugma Lakach, here's an example. Yedu Mekisvi Ha'arizal, the Inin Chazar Sashatz Yeshba Mala Atsuma al Tefilas Halachash. So he quotes from the Kisvi Hari that Chazar Sashatz, right, the repetition of the Amida, he says it has many incredible ideas behind it that are even more so than the private davening, the private Amida that we say ourselves. Ve'yeshavdo ben shnei chelkei tefila elu madregos bli shir ve'arach ve'al zeh ramzu Chazal Yispalo v'lo ne'ene yachshav yispalo v'farish hagara dahainu Chazar Sashatz. The Gemara says if you daven and you're not answered, you should daven again. The Gemara says, what does that mean, daven again? The Gemara says that's Chazar Sashatz. That's the power of Chazar Sashatz. That, I think we talked about this a little bit maybe last week too. The individual versus davening betzibur and the power of davening betzibur. He says, debat tluya anias atfila. That's the answering of prayer really is davening betzibur leads to or is required for aniyas atfila. Yazanem marhain kel kavir lo yimas v'darshu chazal ein hakadosh baruch hu moes betfilas and sharabim. What does it mean that he would never he doesn't get disgusted, right? Lo yimas, right? He doesn't get disgusted. Hakadosh baruch hu will never feel that way about our tefillah when we're davening betzibur. The Chazar Sashatz b'mehusa hi tefillah shel tzibur. Remez l'chol zeh hu mash tefillas amida chova shetehei belachash v'chazar Sashatz b'kol ram. And he says, we see a hint of that in the fact that we daven silently, and it has to be. It should be silent that nobody else can hear our davening. Yet when we do Chazar Sashatz, that has to be b'kol ram, where everybody can hear it. So there's a remez there that there is a certain power to Chazar Sashatz. Shetfilas alachash lerov yukrasahi ka'adam ha-machbi yahalum yakar shelo yachtafuhu listim imenu. Mashenke Chazar Sashatz dargalsahi kolkach al yona she'ein sham amagal listim bekochas l'roim klau. That there's a certain idea that we want to sort of daven our own private davening sort of quietly, so that it's as if we're hiding our valuables so that no one steals them. As opposed to Chazar Sashatz, where the idea is everyone can hear them, because the list and the robbers, the ganuvim out there, they don't have the power to take over that. So it's just sort of bringing out this idea of the power of public prayer. I want to just sort of keep moving just to sort of get through this. But one thing I thought, we won't look at it inside. I was going to bring out another source, but I was looking at the Mishnah Berurah recently. And the Mishnah Berurah, when he talks about Chazar Sashatz, he talks about just how we shouldn't be talking during Chazar Sashatz. And he talks about it just, it's just al pi halacha, but he quotes the Kolbo, who says that shuls have been destroyed. And this is, going back, the Kolbo lived 400 or 500 years ago. But he says shuls have been destroyed, kiyadua, apparently, because people were talking at points in davening like chazor sashatz. And I was just thinking that the two together, right? We're seeing the power of chazor sashatz, but we're also seeing and perhaps that's the opposite, is the destructive force, that when we don't take into account the power of the davening, we belittle it by talking, that could be problematic as well. But I think that's another example of maybe where we see the Tefilah Torah. We still have to learn halacha. We still have to learn how we daven al pi halacha, but we have to put in the emphasis to understand like the power of davening, like this example from the Kisvei Ari. So we'll keep moving forward on this just for a couple more minutes. Let's see where we got to. Yeah, and he brings another mashal, by the way, of somebody who's who buys a new car and doesn't realize that it has gears, and so he's only driving in first gear until somebody teaches him that he's got second, third, fourth, and fifth gear, and then all of a sudden the car can move faster. And he says that's sometimes that's how we are with tefillah, that we have to realize that there's a second gear, a third gear, a fourth gear, and a fifth gear. So. What, maybe we'll just stop here because we only have a couple minutes left. Maybe what we'll do next week is just finish. There's just a little bit left. And I think he's just got some really sort of basic ideas for how we should be approaching tefillah. It just gives us that structure. He's not going to tell us like what's important about tefillah. We haven't gotten into that yet. He's really still building out the structure for how do we approach it and how do we, how do we prepare ourselves for it. But then we'll finish this, and then I think we'll start to get into more of the meat of let's actually dig into tefillahs and start to understand how we should be learning about tefillah and what are the things that are really important for us to know and to study, so that when we walk into shul, we feel like we've got a better connection to what we're trying to say and what we're trying to accomplish.